Nancy Ramsay. I'm privileged to serve as the director of the Soul Repair Center at Brite Divinity School, and I want to welcome you to the Soul Repair Center April 2024 webinar. Since November of 2020, the center has offered free monthly webinars September through May, intended to inform military and VA chaplains, as well as faculty, religious leaders, and chaplains in various settings who serve retired and active duty military and chaplains and their families. The center's website also offers extensive archival resources on moral injury. Today's webinar is valuable for all who engage with combat veterans, and especially those of the wars in Iraq and the Second War in Afghanistan. These webinars are co-sponsored by the Shea Center on Moral Injury, part of the VOA network. The Shea Center is directed by Christine Chong. Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, who founded the Soul Repair Center at Brite in 2012, serves as the Senior Vice President at VOA for Moral Injury Programs. In today's webinar, in which we'll feature an opportunity to engage with veterans of the war in Iraq and an independent filmmaker who collaborated with one of them in creating a powerful film, What I Want You to Know. Many of you have taken advantage of the opportunity to view the film in advance of this webinar. The film is a gripping and intimate account of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars told through the interviews with veterans who fought in these wars. The film was executive produced by two veterans. It had its world premiere at the Maine International Film Festival, where it won the Audience Favorite Award. It was an official selection at the International Film Festival in The Hague. It won an award of excellence from the Impact Docs Awards. Through the generosity of Catie Foertsch, the filmmaker, this film will remain available to viewers through tomorrow. Our presenters include Travis Weiner, executive producer and film participant. Travis served with the 502nd Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, from 2004 to 2009, deploying twice to Iraq. Travis left the Army in 2009 as a sergeant. He attended the University of Massachusetts, earning his degree in 2012. Then worked for Mass General Hospital and the Red Sox Foundation's home base program as a veteran outreach worker, peer support specialist. He left home base in 2014 to attend the University of Colorado Law School. He currently works as a senior deputy state public defender in Weld County, Colorado. Alan Pitts, a film participant, is a son of a member of the U.S. Army Special Forces. Alan served in the 44th Engineer Battalion, 2nd Infantry, and deployed to Iraq in 2004. He completed his service in the Army as a sergeant. Catie Foertsch, director, is a former journalist and veteran corporate filmmaker who lives outside of Boston, Massachusetts. This is her first feature-length documentary film. I will serve as moderator of our webinar. Our chat monitor is Kyle Fauntleroy, a development officer at Brite and a retired captain in the U.S. Navy Chaplain Corps. Kyle is a founding member of the Center's National Advisory Board. He'll prioritize questions you send to him through chat for our panelists. We are also grateful to Sam McAllister, the production manager at VOA, who will bring his expertise to this webinar. Our program will proceed with opening comments by the three guest speakers. Then I will join them briefly for further conversation near the top of the next hour. At 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll focus on questions you pose in the chat. Participants are welcome to post questions on the chat that you hope can be posed to the speakers following their initial presentations. And at 3:30, we'll conclude with the webinar. I remind you that a link to the program will be available within 10 days at the tab on the Soul Repair Center website. Links to all prior webinars are also available. All our webinars are posted as links on this site and at the VOA YouTube channel. Ordinarily, the link is available within 10 days. So now let's begin what will really be a conversation between me and our three presenters, and we'll look forward to welcoming your questions at the top of the next hour. All right, friends. Well, I think I'll start this conversation with Catie, and then we'll move to including to you, Travis, and Alan. So, Catie, how did you experience the words of the veterans and the images of the civilians in the film?
So Nancy, let me first start by saying thank you very much, and thanks to the Soul Repair Center for making the film available to this community of caregivers and for having Travis, Allen, and myself here to talk about it today. We're very grateful. So how did I experience the words of the veterans? As a civilian, I have no experience in the military. I have no experience of war. And as I'm sure the audience can imagine, doing those interviews was at times overwhelming. A few of the veterans in the film had less kinetic deployments, and they were able to discuss the wars and their experiences more abstractly. And those interviews were easier to do. I had done some reading, I had followed the wars in the news media, so it was a conversation. But some of the veterans in the film, the ones whose deployments were more kinetic, those were more difficult. And some had not really done much processing at all. Some hadn't really talked to anybody at all about what they talked about in the film. And so that, for me as an interviewer, that was a very raw experience.
Right.
And I had to, there were times when I realized that I had stopped breathing, and I had to remember to breathe. And I had to remind myself it's okay to pause before you speak, because the important thing is that my voice wasn't breaking, because, some of the things they were telling me were just so terribly sad. But as an interviewer, and I'm sure that your audience probably understands this, as soon as you tear up, as soon as your voice starts to break, now they're worried about you, and that takes them away from what they're talking about. So that was a struggle for me in some of the interviews.
Well, of course, they'd also know that you were touched by the story, so that it's not all bad. But please, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you were pausing there.
No, it's okay. When it came to the edit, being immersed in this material for a year was difficult. And there were times when I had to just step away for a week or two, because you can't live in profound sadness all the time. But it made me realize, maybe think about this audience, because that's what you folks do. And you don't have the luxury of saying to a client, this is really too heavy for me. I need to step away for a week or two. Why don't we reconvene later? Like, you're there and you stay there. So you're doing really important work.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, for some of the folks that are watching that might be faculty working with a veteran that discovers they're a combat veteran and inquires, they might not have much experience with it. So your words are helpful, or a physician or a nurse, a social worker. What you're sharing is certainly valuable there. You've begun to talk about this, but Catie, how has making the film affected you? What do you know now about war that you did not know before?
So I'm fairly widely read, and I understand that war is not a Hollywood movie. I understand that war is chaotic. I know terrible things happen to the people that are fighting and to civilians that are on the ground. I know that anytime you arm human beings with the kind of armaments that the United States military provides, especially when they're teenagers, and you send them into another country, mistakes are going to be made. People are going to die. They're going to die. It's going to be awful. I know that. But there's a difference in knowing with your head, knowing intellectually, and knowing with your heart. And making the film forced me, and I think watching the film maybe forces the audience also, to go from what you know in your head to opening your heart and being able to listen and to accept an experience that you've never had and you're never going to have. And really, you're probably more comfortable not thinking about it. So, like I said, I've never been in combat, but doing these interviews and spending so much time in the edit process, watching faces, watching eyes, listening to these terrible stories, it made me hear, it made me know in a way that I hadn't known before. And that is empathy, right? It opens us up to empathy. And that is a goal of the film. I've always thought about veterans as someone else. You know, when I was growing up, they were the old guys who marched in the Memorial Day parade. They were the Vietnam veterans who had the hats on, you know, with the things they put on their hats so they recognize each other. But it was them. It was people who had no intersection with my life. And making the film created that intersection. And in terms of how it affected me, for a long time, it made me angry. I'm not a patient person. And while I was doing the editing and while I was doing the interviews, I was a lot less patient than I usually am with people who would complain about things that were meaningless. Like you're at the grocery store and the person in front of you turns around and says, it really upsets me that they've gotten rid of the plastic bags. I don't like these paper bags. Or my neighbor would say, my lawn service did a terrible job mowing my lawn. It just ruined my day. And you know, there were times when I just wanted to explode because people were not paying attention. We had these terrible wars. We had these catastrophic wars, and there has been no reckoning. The country just doesn't want to think about it. But then I realized that anger is a normal response to a feeling of betrayal. And as a citizen, I was feeling betrayed. I was feeling betrayed by my government, by military leaders who made bad decisions, and there were no consequences for bad decisions. So more bad decisions got made. And then eventually I realized that anger is a wall and it stops you from doing anything else except being angry. So I had to do some work and get past my anger and think in terms of problems. There are problems that need solutions, and the film is an attempt at a solution for a problem. And looking at it in that way has really helped me settle down and leave my anger behind, which is a much more sustainable place to be.
Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll be circling back to some of those themes. And, you know, Travis, I'm wondering what experience in Iraq led you to decide this film was needed and you wanted to be part of it?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. It wasn't one experience. It wasn't a situation where, something happened. I just kind of knew I had to make the film. I think the collective experiences I had on my deployments were difficult to kind of synthesize and make sense of. I credit definitely a few folks. I had a professor at UMass Boston named Paul Atwood, and he's a Vietnam era veteran, and he's essentially spent his entire career writing about the United States military and its various misadventures. And he helped me to kind of, I think he recognized that I kind of had those thoughts, but hadn't been able to verbalize it. He kind of helped me a lot. And then when I met Tommy Furlong, our co-executive producer, Tommy's a Marine lieutenant who served in Afghanistan. We both worked at the home base program. I think more than anything, I think the tipping point was we in this program encountered a lot of veterans. So we worked on like a social work team, and it was a mental health program for vets. It was a very prestigious and wealthy program funded by defense contractors, the Boston Red Sox, Mass General Hospital, Harvard Medical School. And I think what we found was that there were a lot of veterans, and this was corroborated and kind of verified in the Pew Research poll that we cite in our film, that their feelings about their experience did not fit the narrative that, for lack of a better term, the veteran support industry wanted to impose on them. It wasn't neat, it wasn't clean, but it was true, and it was frustrating to us. And we felt like, we were aware of, some books and films and whatnot, but we felt like a film like we wanted to make was not out there. A film that would validate these experiences and expose people to them and make people realize that this is how a lot of veterans feel. This is not an outlier. And so I think that discussions with him, and then obviously, linking up with Catie to actually make the film, which we could not ever have done ourselves, is probably the best kind of overall explanation for how the film came to be.
Thanks a lot. Ellen, I want to ask you the same question. What experiences in Iraq led you to decide that this film was needed and particularly that you wanted to be part of it?
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. Much like Travis just said, wasn't one particular. There was multiple experiences. You know, combat is it's horrible and it's awful, and sometimes you have to do things that just seem completely out of touch with what you think you're capable of. But to start with, first, seeing how evil humans can be to other humans, seeing the lengths that some folks would go to hurt other people because they're from a different tribe, or they're fighting the U.S. military. So I started questioning the purpose. I was questioning the purpose of the war before I deployed in early 2004. But more so when I got there and started to experience these things, started to talk to some close friends around me. There was never talk about a movie that came further on from a mutual friend reaching out to me saying, "Hey, I had met Travis prior to they're doing this film, blah blah blah." And I was like, "This sounds something great. I want to tell my story." And then the one specific thing that happened to me was the night I was wounded and my convoy was ambushed, and my squad ended up getting left in the middle of our Ramadi, Iraq, for a few hours by my CO, who just left us out there to fight like a 200-meter long ambush. So that was kind of the final straw, basically. Like, yeah, they don't appreciate it. Like, they'll use you for what they want to use you for, and then beyond that, you're kind of no good to them. So I started telling that story immediately when I got to Longstool, any newspaper who would talk to me, foreign newspapers, American newspapers. And I've been doing that for the last 20 years. And this film just gave me a little larger platform to speak my truth and to let folks know about my experiences.
Thanks. I'm glad you're going to be part of this, or you are part of today's conversation. Catie, I also want to ask you to feel free to share what led you to invest yourself in creating this film.
Well, when I talked to Travis and Tommy about why they wanted to make a film and what they wanted the film to do, it was very clear to me that it was an important story and that making it would be a patriotic act, not patriotism in the sense of that we sometimes come to think of patriotism, which is, as you see in the film, it's the flyover at the football game, and it's the rolling out the giant flag, and it's essentially doing things that make us feel good. In my mind, patriotism it's the John F. Kennedy thing. It's like, what can you do, not what can make you feel good. So it felt like a duty because I'm a storyteller, and it felt like a duty because I'm a citizen, and I want to see my country do better.
Mm-hmm. So part of what it strikes me about the three stories together, or the three motivations, is both helpful for you personally in terms of continuing to process a very difficult experience, but also a hope to give back in a way of, truth telling about that experience in hopes that that would be helpful to others, both civilian and combat veterans. Did I get that right? More or less? Okay. I think this film helps civilians better understand the effect of the war in Iraq on civilian populations, including its children. Travis, you and Catie chose to include multiple scenes illustrating the effects of combat for civilian populations, as well as for American troops. What did each of you hope civilians would learn and experience about the war in Iraq from seeing the consequences for combat in Iraqi civilians of all ages?
Sure, it's an excellent question, Nancy. I appreciate it. I think as a threshold matter, and we talked a lot about this as filmmakers. There's a difficult tension. There's a lot of tensions in making a film that require a lot of very hard, difficult discussions, a lot of mutual respect, and then you have to make creative decisions. I think that we all agreed on some basic premises, right? I think we all felt strongly that we are not. It's the old, two things can be true at once adage, but it was important to us not to have a framework of, we don't want to show anything that's too rough to see. We want to protect or sanitize anything. We, of course, didn't want to do that. But we also didn't want to turn people off and just introduce, gratuitous violence. And as Catie can tell you, probably better, certainly better than I can, because she's been through so much of the footage. So much of the footage is ironically available from the Defense Department and online, et cetera. There's oceans of footage available on the internet that we could have included exponentially more times, graphic and whatnot than we included, right? So I think, from our creative perspective and for the message of the film, it was important to strike a balance. On the one hand, it was important not to sanitize and not to approach it with, we're not going to show any photos of any, injuries or something that might make someone uncomfortable, right? Not at all. We also, wanted to do so in a way that got the message across and wasn't just gratuitous for the sake of, pure shock value. And of course, the overarching issue of the fact that we have, 90 minutes or 100 minutes to make the film. And, with what we had, we could have made it, 3-4 hours easy. So all of those things kind of coalesced. It was important to us to show that, right? Because that is the reality of it. And, and I'm sure Alan can speak to this as well, right? But it's like, even nowadays, one of our interviewees, Miles Lugosi, who's written a book and made a film that I highly recommend you all check out. He went through this, at the heart of it, right? He was went after by the United States government for showing the truth about what happens over there, because that's not good for them, right? It's not something that increases recruitment into the military. It's not something that makes people support the war. But if you're going as a society and if as a government, we're going to make these decisions and send folks like us over there and have these things happen, it's something, that's so important and so serious that it seems to me like at that point, you have to treat the American public like grown-ups, and you can't take a position, and our government has taken this position and continues to take this position of, we want to try to censor, sanitize, and protect the American public from these images. That's a long answer, but yeah, that's what I got. I obviously want to hear what Alan has to say too about that.
Yeah, no, I can.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you could restate the question. Okay,
that's what I was going to do. What experiences in Iraq led you to decide? Sorry, that's not the question, is it? This film helps civilians better understand the effect of the war, and what did you want particularly to happen from this film, and including the multiple scenes that it includes that led you to really invest yourself in it?
Yeah, thanks for restating. No, I completely agree with everything Travis said. I think, and the government does sanitize combat as much as we have embedded reporters. And I was speaking to this earlier before the webinar started. Civilians see war and combat through two separate kind of screens. One is what the media shows them, and two, they're sitting in front of their television or their computer screen, and just looking at it like it's some kind of video game. And folks need to know that it's most definitely not a video game. The civilian population in Iraq, and the way they were treated, it was pretty disgusting. And I was there in 2004, which is relatively early on, the first year or so of like major combat operations in Iraq. And you have civilians just trying to go about their day, going to the market, going down the street, trying to get a kid to school, and then there'd be a massive firefight or an IED would break out, and they're just ducking in and out of buildings, continuing to walk down the street. And it just blew my mind in a way that I tried to put myself in their shoes and think like, I'm originally from New Jersey, like, oh, if I was going to go catch the bus to school and there was a major firefight going on, it would be completely absurd.
Mhm.
But they were just so used to it, and it was disgusting in a way that we were at fault for making them completely used to it. And how the United States government and the media portrayed, how we were treating civilians, and this whole trying to win hearts and minds, which, really couldn't be further from the truth. But yeah, for American civilians, who've not ever experienced war, it's one I hope you never have to. And two, it's awful in many ways. And we hope that the film shows that there's not just one experience in combat. You do get veterans that got a lot out of their deployments or enjoyed going to combat, and going to Iraq or Afghanistan 6, 7, 8 times, and that's all fine with them. But we wanted to show the other side that it's not fine with a lot of us. So
Katie, I'm thinking about the ways in which, in actually putting this together, that you were focusing on these scenes intently multiple times, I would assume. And I'm wondering how that was for you as you chose scenes, as you were probably went to sleep thinking about one scene or another that was very difficult, or maybe you've got a strategy to avoid that. But what, as you put this film together with the expertise that you bring, what was that experience like for you to have this, collage of painful illustrations, knowing this was coming from the direction of your country, and the impact, especially on civilians? What was that like?
Well, it was not easy. It was not easy at all. I'm a mother, seeing images of dead children, and as you say, knowing that they were dead because my country sent the US military into their country, that wasn't easy. I had to find a space where I wasn't thinking as much about what the images showed as I was thinking about their composition. And I was thinking about, where was the image taken? And did it fit in the film where I needed it to fit? And the same was true with some of the video clips that you see, especially the ones of explosions, trying not to think about all the young people I know. It could have been them in the vehicle that exploded. It could have been them that now they have a brain injury. Now their whole life has changed because of these explosions. I had to not think about that and just focus on the technical aspects of, does this fit here in the film? And does this show what I'm trying to show?
Thank you. Katie and Travis in particular, how would each of you describe the experience of making the film and how you find it affects you to watch it now?
The experience of making the film was, well, for starters, it was kind of like another life lesson that you learn and you think, I thought I kind of knew this already, in the
Right.
sense, me and Tommy, thought, we've got the idea for the film. We know what we want to do. The rest is gravy. And it was quite the opposite. If it weren't for Katie, this never would have been made, because we had no idea what we were doing. It was kind of like drinking from a fire hose in terms of learning just the basic things that that they say, and I think they're somewhat true. We've experienced you have to do to have a chance of a documentary film having any success, in terms of the people you have to hire to check it legally, the people you have to hire to assist you in entering it into festivals. And so that was great, and really cannot give enough credit to Katie, because the situation, well, in addition to COVID, that delayed for sure the completion of the film by probably more than a year, but the situation was such that shortly after we began making the film, Catie will correct me, I can't remember if this is a year or two after we were in, you know, it's the three of us, right? So we are on a shoestring budget. We are relying primarily, at least at the start, on me and Tommy's kind of military contacts, et cetera. You know, we were lucky in the sense that Catie had the knowledge and the relationships, technically speaking, with videographer folks and whatnot. But then I moved to Colorado. I was in school full time. Tommy was a full-time student and was working. And so, you know, how this film progressed was essentially when, you know, Catie said, you know, all right, guys, we got to meet, and you know, over and over, kind of force that issue so that we could work through all the issues that we needed to complete the film. The experience and kind of the lessons learned is, you know, essentially, if you're going to, I mean, it was just out of necessity, but if you're going to do it like that, it takes a lot of patience, and it'll be delayed, but you know, can't give enough credit to the small team, because I think, you know, no matter what, I mean, we changed the name, we worked through all these, you know, creative visions and the music and how to try to distribute it. And no matter what, we all have these different ideas. The important thing, and the thing I'm eternally grateful for, right, is that on the core issues, right, there's no daylight between us, right? None of us is trying to make this film to make the most money possible. None of us is willing to give up the creative rights and allow someone to change it. We just want a lot of people to see this film. And, you know, we can disagree at times about how to get there, but we really don't much. We just work through a lot of things together. So that experience has been extremely rewarding and enriching. In addition, I should add, being able to see and work with the vets that we filmed, you know, vets like Alan. I mean, so many of the vets that we filmed, like Alan and Garrett and Danny, you know, are you know, I consider them like titans in this field of veterans that speak about and work on these issues. And it was, you know, can't say how grateful we were to get them to participate in the film. Miles, you know, so we were so lucky to have these vets that are so good at articulating this kind of experience and point of view, participate in the film. So yeah, that would be kind of my synopsis of the experience, but I'll obviously let Catie chime in.
Okay, Catie, and then I will ask Alan. Go ahead.
Okay. So Travis just kind of ran through the difficulties of making the film. This is a little independent film. They are never easy to make. They usually take about 5 years. This one took us 5 years. And right in the middle was the pandemic. So, you know, it's just not an easy thing to do. You know, Nancy, you asked about watching it. What is it like to watch it? And as the editor, I've seen it so many times that most of the time when I watch it now, I don't see it. I see the craft that went into it. I see the scenes and how they were cut and how they were selected. But every once in a while, when I'm watching it, I get pulled in. And then I am just filled with sorrow all over again for what is depicted in the film. And since making it, you know, one of the things that is really impactful for me are the comments that we get, especially from veterans. So we did a screening a couple of weeks ago for a school in Ohio. And afterwards, there was a veteran in the audience. He raised his hand. He said that many veterans don't know how to talk about their experiences, or they don't want to talk about them. But at the same time, do veterans want people to know? Yes. Civilians don't understand what deployment is, and this film is a way to help that. And you know, I just realized that is a person who maybe has never talked about his own deployment, but who is just responding to the fact that there were civilians in the audience who now have gotten a little bit of what it is he doesn't want to talk about. So that was very meaningful.
Thank you. Alan, you came to this a little later. What was it like the first time you saw the film?
I'll start with how I felt when I was first interviewed for the film, and
Okay.
I might be a little different than some other folks, but I found it cathartic. I've been speaking my story for 20 years, in the hopes that I could help one person, and I think I've helped some folks in 20 years. Watching the film, it was a rough watch, but I was also not surprised how similar folks' stories are. I mean, I knew some folks personally and I knew their stories, but other folks I didn't, and learned about them and learned how similar we all feel, which I kind of had a feeling that's what I was gonna notice. But yeah, it's yeah, I wasn't surprised. I wasn't surprised how folks were treated and how their experiences were exactly the same as mine.
Yeah. You know, there's in the conversation or the study, I suppose you could say, of moral injury, that as we develop that concept, there are two phrases. One is called agential moral injury, when it's something that it's in my own behavior or agency that betrays what I know is morally right. And receptive moral injury describes experiencing or observing the actions of another or others that violate what I understand to be uh, immoral behavior, the absence of moral behavior. And I think, in my experience of watching the film, I would assume you're ordered to do some things that you do that that you don't have a chance to, you don't have a choice maybe about that order, most of the time. And other times there are plenty of scenes where I know what you were showing us, what you had to watch, that showed you the consequences, if not of your own behavior, of decisions of the government that affected civilians who had nothing to do with what with the supposed causes of this war. So I'm interested in how those two aspects of moral injury, agential, where you have to cope with what you did, or failed to do, and receptive moral injury, what you observed, that others did in the course of that time. And Catie, you may want to comment on this too, from helping put the film together. But could you talk a bit about those two aspects of moral injury? I don't care who goes first.
Yeah, I guess I'll comment a little bit. It's another excellent
Okay.
question, Nancy. I think for me, I mean, I count myself lucky. There were I mean, there are a lot of things that, a lot of the vets kind of talked about in the film, myself included, that out of necessity didn't make it into the final cut based on timing. But there are a couple stories that, I told and I've told about shooting at Iraqis that were probably not insurgents, that were just confused on a roadway and missing them, of spotting an Iraqi who turned out to be digging out his, call them bongo trucks, just small pickup trucks over there, and almost having, others in the platoon shoot and kill that person because I had spotted him out. For me personally, I consider myself lucky in that those are kind of, the limits of which I went up to, in terms of, like, doing arguably one of the most kind of egregious acts, right? Killing an innocent person. There were other things, too much, too detailed to kind of go into, did not, I don't know that we necessarily at the time. There were certainly other things that I don't like that I did, that I have a lot of moral injury about. But I guess I would say I think, man, if that had happened, who knows? There were other times where it's entirely possible I might have hit somebody firing. So it definitely, just to me personally, I can only speak about it personally, rationalizing all the academic literature in the world, at the end of the day, I'm not going to excuse myself or agree that, I was just part of something and did the right thing. And, I think a lot of vets are really eloquent about that in the film. Probably Garrett is an excellent example. I definitely identify, in terms of the second one, the participation. It's a very complicated, nuanced issue. Some people might say, well, You know, the fact that you weren't a conscientious objector or participated in it, or anybody, right? It just makes you complicit. There are a lot of, it's a complicated issue, and I think reasonable people can argue about it.
Sure.
But you know, without question, I think I probably struggle equally, maybe even more, with what I participated in on a larger scale. I think that I was young, but I think deep down I knew that what we were doing was very nonsensical, very wrong, both what we were doing it, why we were supposedly doing it, how we were doing it. But there's no stopping that train, essentially.
Yeah.
You know, there were times, you know, I just kind of end with this, there were times in the second deployment where, you know, folks in the unit had been, you know, hurt or hit by ADs, and, you know, same as the first one, right? The military is so pernicious in playing on the grunts emotions, right? You're told, you know, we think we've got the person, we think we've got the terrorist cell or the guy that planted the wire or shot the person, and you're told this, and it's so incredibly immoral and irresponsible, because, you know, the chances that it's accurate are probably not good. And in fact, we found out we had snatched somebody that we were told had been responsible for killing, you know, fellow soldiers in the second deployment, and my fellow soldiers began to abuse him in the back of the truck, and me and another soldier, it was to a point of, you know, we were going to be using violence on each other. We stopped it. Though one of those soldiers, who remains a very good friend of mine, later, you know, told me a lot later, when we actually found out from our intelligence op, oh, sorry, wrong guy, told me, thank you for doing that. I wasn't in my right mind. I was just upset.
Right.
You know, moments like that are tiny little good things in the
Right.
moral injury context. Personally, they're a drop in the bucket, and they don't, in my mind, absolve anything that else that I did or participated in.
What did play on you, those memories? Just to repeat the question, because for some of our audience, these are new terms. So what I was asking about, Alan, was both experiences of agential moral injury, that is, that haunt you because you know you did it, or receptive moral injury, when you were ordered to do something, or when when our government acted in a way that you observed. So it was receptive in the sense that you didn't cause it, but you experienced it.
Yes. I think it's interesting, because I have one of the same exact stories as Travis had. Instead of back of a truck, it was the back of a helicopter. And this supposedly was the guy that blew us up and killed two of my buddies. And it's interesting, because I did the same thing. I spoke out and stopped it, but it's very much, you're afraid to speak sometimes, because then you could be kind of PNG, like persona non grata, or like blacklisted. And then, you know, folks, oh, you know, Sergeant Pitts, you know, stopped us from doing this, you know, we can't trust him. I'm a little different, where I think I struggle more with the receptive side of moral injury. I accepted the fact when I was deployed, much like Travis, I kind of realized beforehand that we shouldn't be here. This is for the wrong reasons, but it was also, I wanted to get home, and I wanted my buddies next to me to get home. So I accepted the fact that I was going to have to bend my morals a little bit and do certain things. But I always played within the box. Like, if this is my hard left and this is my hard right, I never skewed from that. And I'm not trying to justify some of the things I've done. I've worked through those things and processed them. But the receptive side of it, I go back to what I said earlier, is just seeing how evil humans could be to each other. Seeing, you know, going in the houses and seeing Iraqis chained against the walls and tortured, and, you know, they had our interpreter went missing, and they found him because he was helping the Americans, and they cut both of his arms off and dropped him at the front of our gate. or the guy that used to drive the truck that would clean out our porta-johns. He disappeared one day and did the same thing to him. And next thing you know, his 10-year-old son is fatherless and mom's long gone. So seeing those things is what I've struggled with the most, and then experiencing them firsthand with my own situation of being wounded and being left in the middle of a city by my own captain, who's supposed to be in charge, who's supposed to take care of us, and him just leaving the entire squad by ourselves. And then to make matters worse, not even knowing that we were left out there. And then no repercussions for his actions. So I still struggle with those things. I've moved past the anger. My best friend died that night on mission, so I've constantly lived with, shame and survivor's guilt because of that. So, what's interesting is prior to getting filmed for this or getting recorded for this film, I had not really heard the term moral injury all that much. But since, it's been kind of like oh man, like this makes so much sense, there's more to it than just, your run of the mill PTSD. So yeah, to just kind of paraphrase, like, the receptive side of the moral injury, I think I struggle with the most.
Yeah, you're right. It is really different than PTSD, the fear that you're going to die. It is more coming to terms with either what you have done or what persons you've trusted have done or put you in the position of dealing with. So I really appreciate those reflections, and I want to shift this a little, and because I'm thinking about our audience, which includes others that work with veterans, maybe in military veterans, but or VA chaplains, but it also is going to include some nurses and social workers and physicians, um, hospital chaplains, and I'm interested in what you hope the film will help them to understand about engaging with veterans, maybe in their classroom, as I said, or being more sensitive in a clinic setting of any kind. Um, what are you hoping that these professionals that are watching, and sometimes religious leaders are, I would expect, are also on this webinar? What do you want them to know, to understand?
I'll take a first crack at it. I mean, I think it's the same as a baseline. It's the same thing that we hope that the members of the public, policymakers, everybody understand, right? Everything I talked about in terms of why I made the film. I think the additional piece I would add to it, right, is that some things you can't really treat, right? I mean, me and Tommy ran into this at home base where we worked with amazing clinicians. I mean, some world-class folks that really wanted to help veterans, right? They also relied on us a lot to navigate, like military culture and how to talk to veterans, et cetera. And, maybe one of the reasons why more, I don't claim to know, right? But maybe one of the reasons why moral injury isn't much more prevalent in the VA treatment modalities and discussions, et cetera, is because there's not an evidence-based treatment for it, right? You can't, I mean, certainly there are things you can do and, there's so much being talked about, right? But this is not something where you can prescribe something and have, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, make it go away. And it is very difficult to engage with, right, without grappling with the truth of what the veteran is saying, right? And me and Tommy, we had serious issues at home base with some of the leadership on this is that it is not a quote unquote political, statement or thing to do to validate what a veteran is saying. One of the things we would always tell, the clinicians we're working with is like, don't placate, don't infantilize, because this is the wrong time to do it and the wrong kind of, thing to do it with. This is what you get, right? This is what you get when you do, when we as a society make a decision, right? Everyone is complicit. When we make a decision that we're going to let these things happen over and over again, as much as, various actors in the veteran support industry, certainly the defense industry and our body politic, as much as they want it to be a neat, clean narrative, certainly at home base, Tommy and I ran into this, right? It doesn't fit on a nice slideshow about post-traumatic stress and heroism. It is not, and it dishonors veterans in my experience. I think I can speak for Tommy on this too, in this sense, and it does not help them heal, right? To get, even if it's well-meaning, and certainly some of it was well-meaning. We went through this with the clinical team at home base, right? To placate them or try to redirect the moral injury into PTSD, you have to validate, right? And so that is what I would really put to clinicians in terms of what I would hope from in the clinical piece the film would accomplish.
Let me, Alan, ask you, what are you hoping your involvement now in representing this film and talking with persons, what do you hope the outcome would mean for the ways, particularly folks teaching or in various ministries or in nursing or social work? What difference do you hope this film will make?
I agree a lot with what Travis just said. Don't placate. You have to, don't infantilize. It's a difficult question for me to answer. But I just, folks need to, I think, know the difference. I'm not talking about clinicians. I'm talking about veterans. But there's a difference between PTSD and moral injury.
Right.
And I think that clinicians should, and I know they're aware of that. Let the veteran know that, because like there's this stigma around PTSD, especially active duty or just getting out, and you're supposed to be this tough guy. You did all these like tough things in the military, and now you're like, well, I can't sleep at night, and I'm afraid to go to a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say those things. And not everything is PTSD. So just explaining the difference and bringing the term moral injury more into like the national consciousness, because outside I think of this film and clinicians and my social group, like you don't hear about it a lot. So I just think like educating the veteran that like these aren't dirty words. It's okay to feel this way. The film obviously shows that there's a lot of us that feel this way. So just let them know that like things are okay, and there's other folks out there that feel like you, and you could get better.
Is that partly, I want to build on a question that's been sent to me. Yeah, the question was, what would you want, or what would be most helpful from a chaplain if that chaplain came to you? What would be helpful, and what would not be as helpful? And I realize that's quite a personal, at one level, certainly a very personal response. But I think what you're getting at is what you were saying. Not, I'll let you state this in your own words. But for you, if a person wanted to be helpful, what practices, what particular strategies would be more effective than others?
So just so I understand the question, if a chaplain came to me, putting myself in the position of a service member or a veteran,
Yeah, it said yeah. Let me if the question was, if you had access to an active duty chaplain, or one came to you, what did the chaplain do and not do well?
Sure. I'm just speaking from my personal
Sure, of
experience and
course.
kind of my belief system. I am an atheist. I've pretty much always been an atheist. Maybe a little spiritual would be more the way to describe me. And the best experience I had on with a chaplain was on my first deployment, Captain McCosh, because he recognized that in a deployment like that, and this is my opinion, in his capacity, it was his job not to proselytize, not to inquire whatsoever about anyone's religious affiliation or give them any kind of religious scripture or teaching, because contrary to the popular saying, there are many atheists in the foxholes. In fact, I knew plenty of them, and I was one, right? So, it was just to be, a form of support kind of outside of the normal chain of command. And if that meant, swearing and talking about all manner of vice and explicit things with a bunch of dirty infantry guys, that's what your job is, or should be. I had not experienced this directly. I think I saw subsequent chaplains when I was in do this, and it's, in my opinion, very selfish and hypocritical. You're not supposed to be proselytizing or telling a grunt who is being sent out every day to go try to find a bomb they can maybe explode, that God is looking out for them, or they're doing it for the right reasons. That does not help, and that is not a good thing that a leader should do. So that's difficult. I recognize that I recognize there might be chaplains listening to me saying, well, wait a minute, I'm a chaplain, right? And I don't pretend to say it's not difficult, right? But in my experience, especially with combat troops in a deployment like that, we're dealing with these issues. Others certainly absolutely could feel differently. I just, speak for myself and others who might feel similarly. The last thing in the world we want to hear, do, or talk about is anything having to do with religion.
Right. I want to clarify that the chaplains in the military are trained not to do that.
Sure. No, I 100%. Part of the reason I mention it is because I have these distinct memories of the chaplains after Chaplain McCosh. There's like two of them I can think of. I saw it. They never did it to me directly, but I saw them doing it all the time. There are anecdotal stories out there of them doing it. So,
Sure.
So yeah, that would be my answer on that.
Okay. Alan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, same. I'm an atheist as well. I went to Catholic school my whole life. I started falling out of faith back in high school. My experiences in Iraq kind of solidified my atheism. And just to add a little more to what Travis was saying and what I mentioned earlier, you're almost taught when you're on deployment to not talk to anybody about what you're going through. So you didn't want to be the guy going to talk to the chaplain about how you have to, take 6 Benadryl to go to bed. So you're just kind of, you avoid them. But again, I did see a few proselytize, and but my experiences with them were small. I never really spoke with them. But yeah, it's hard to get soldiers, combat armed soldiers that are going out every day and getting into firefights, to come home at night and talk to you about their feelings, because they're not going to do that. Hopefully afterwards, when all's said and done, they will. But yeah, that's a difficult thing to get soldiers to do.
Would it be safe to say, or would it be accurate to say, because we're going to turn, we'll also be opening up to more conversation with the audience in a moment, that you're not inviting, that your preference would not be having somebody try to persuade you about a particular interpretation or presence of the divine, for example, but persons who are sensitive to the trauma of that experience, of what you've witnessed in a battle scene, or the loss of the death of somebody you loved as a comrade beside you, somebody who's empathic about that. That would be a different kind of presence. Would that be accurate? Have I heard that correctly? Yeah.
Yeah, from mine, I think so. Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it, Nancy.
Okay. And would that, when you think about maybe your own experience or others, are there, this is almost more like PTSD or flashbacks, but when you're in a context where perhaps you're being cared for, whether that's a medical appointment or social work or something like that, what are particular things you would caution folks to be professionals in such in professions like that, or even in college classrooms, maybe referencing war, um, what would be important for them to be aware of for combat veterans?
My answer to this is a mix of my professional and personal experiences. One of the things I'm grateful for in working at the home base program is, despite many very serious disagreements on some of the things I talked about in terms of moral injury and the direction of the program, they were second to none in evidence-based treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. There are issues with statistics and whatnot, but one of the things I learned there that I feel very strongly about to this day, and that I actually experienced personally at the VA, is that, there, I believe the evidence supports the fact, and it's accurate to say, and it's right to say, because it support veterans, that the issue that when people and organizations, some of whom may be entirely well-meaning, some of whom have a financial stake in this issue, when they muddy the waters on PTSD, when the statistics are misquoted, when we exist in a framework in which, and we saw this in the program, veterans are almost told, you have PTSD, now go get services for it.
That's unfortunate. Yeah.
That doesn't help anybody. And that can be both explicit and implicit. And it is so pernicious, and so many very powerful, very wealthy organizations do such a bad job of kind of reframing that, because, right, I mean, I'm speaking plainly here. I lived it, right? There is a financial interest in organizations perpetuating this. I mean, to give you one example, the Wounded Warrior Project, of which I'm a member, when it was founded, I think you had to have a Purple Heart to join. Then you had to have a disability rating. But then they realized they wanted to keep growing, right? They have to keep growing. They have to have the donations coming in. And to the point where now I think you have to just show proof of deploying somewhere, even if it's not a combat zone. I don't mention that because I'm criticizing them, or I'm saying that anyone doesn't deserve the services they get. Not at all. But my point is that what that does, and I'll come full circle now, is when I was receiving services at the Boston VA for a time, with a great long-time clinician there who had worked with Vietnam vets. I believe this even infected him, a very well-respected long-time clinician that initially diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder. It was only through subsequent sessions and kind of talking through this, and we were in a very kind of weird, unique patient-doctor relationship, because he knew that I knew as much about PTSD and the diagnostic criteria almost as he did, because I worked in this program and I was sort of a pseudo clinician myself, but we ended up gaining a lot of trust with each other, and it was good. It was very good. And eventually he kind of agreed that the diagnosis was changed to a sub-threshold PTSD adjustment disorder. But, and again, I don't say this to criticize him. He, like countless numbers of extremely intelligent, well-meaning people in the veteran sphere, clinical sphere, what's happening is they don't even recognize that they are subject to all of this misinformation and not a strict adherence to the reality of it, and that gets perpetuated and that gets passed down. To say nothing of the folks we met in the program that were essentially told, I mean, we served veterans in the program, and I'm glad we did. We helped them, right? But we served veterans in the program that we were pushed to designate and categorize and serve for PTSD, but they hadn't even experienced the Criterion A event in training, right? And so it's just, I think that, again, to me, it's tied to the concept of, it doesn't support and honor veterans to lie about the reasons that we went to war, or to try to placate or pigeonhole them. You're an isolated experience. Similarly, it does not advance the ball on veteran mental health, right? To in any way, go cross, no matter how messy or how talking pointy it is, to talk about, PTSD is a real thing. It's a serious thing. And I believe, given certain levels of combat trauma and exposure, there is no person resilient enough to avoid at least some of its effects, right? But it is a much more complicated, nuanced, and non-prevalent, not as prevalent as its stated issue, I think, than is out there. And I hope that the public and clinicians start to someday understand that.
Well, I want to clarify for a moment that our focus is on moral injury, which is quite different. And PTSD is the fear of death, the fear you're in a situation where um, it, you imagine you might die. Um, but what we're talking about, many more of your illustrations have been the sense of betrayal, either that you were in a situation that betrayed your deepest conscience, you were ordered to do something, or like when the sergeant left you and your group, Alan, um, those you had every reason to trust betrayed that trust. And, that that's enduring. That's hard to work one's way through, as your stories now decades later illustrate. So that's part of why sometimes moral injury is really, it's important to differentiate from a clinical diagnosis like PTSD. And it's lasting moral injury in terms of trying to come to grips with it. But I wanted to insert that for a moment. Alan, I'm glad for you to come back now. If there's more you wanted to say in relation to morally injurious dimensions of your experience before we take up some more questions from the audience.
No, we can move to the audience questions.
Catie, is there anything you wanted to add? Because you found yourself immersed in experiences that were not familiar with you before, and you've heard stories that I'm sure have not gone away. So what is it? What's the experience like? Has it been like? And in some ways, morally injurious in terms of hearing, not maybe not what you did, but what persons who represent your country um, uh, or what you've heard that is maybe resonates for you with what you're learning about moral injury now.
So I guess I just want to share a couple of story. One story is about Garrett, who's the sniper in the film. And in the film, Garrett talks about feeling like he has blood on his hands. And in speaking after the film screens, Garrett has said that it helps him to talk about his moral injury. When we were at Colby College, one of the students said, I don't want to ask you I'm not sure if I can ask you this because I don't want to like trigger you. And I don't want it to bring up things that you don't want to talk about. And Garrett said, please, it helps me to talk about this because the moral injury that I carry around is like a burden to me that is always with me. And when I talk about it, I feel like people are sharing that burden with me. So I think that's an important thing to note. I don't know if every veteran feels that way, but Garrett certainly does. And then the other thing I wanted to note was the veteran in the film, Mike Bergman, who's the one who walked in on the Afghan elder sexually abusing the child, and who was then told by his superiors, that's none of our business. We don't do anything about that. And just watching him in the film, you can see that even though several years had gone by since that happened, it is still so raw for him because he doesn't know what to do with just the magnitude of that betrayal by the people he trusted, by his leaders that he trusted to guide him to do the right thing. So that's one of the stories that really stays with me, as watching Mike's face and seeing how affected he is and just wondering, how does someone get over this? How do you become reconciled to watching that and not stopping it because the people you trusted told you not to stop it?
So let me see if either Travis or Alan wants to comment on that.
Go ahead, Alan.
Oh no, I was shaking my head.
He was going no.
No, thank you.
Yeah. How about you, Travis?
I'm looking at just so I get on the same page. I'm looking at there's some kind
Chat?
of audience questions in the chat.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, so I see 1, 2, 3. Which one are
What
we
is it
on
you
here?
want to, what is it you want to comment on? We'll be able to turn to that in a moment, but is there something that seems relevant to you?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer any of them. I don't have a particular comment to the last one, but just going into the
So
first one.
excuse me just for a moment. You don't have a comment to what Catie has just left.
I
or
can't,
left us
I
with.
guess a better way of putting it is I can't add anything to that. I just agree
Mhm.
with what Catie said, yeah.
I think, Catie, what part of what you're talking about is the pain of I would say receptive moral injury. But some ways agential in the sense, should I have done something, but I was ordered not to do it. So that the moral dilemma that he lives with.
Hmm.
Oh,
If I could just say one more thing,
please,
it's
yeah.
actually a question, and maybe it's a question to this community that's assembled, and it's something that I don't understand, and that is what is or does it complicate moral injury when you have these experiences and you're a very young person, you're a teenager, and you do not have much experience at all in the world, and you don't have experience with being betrayed by your leaders, so you expect that your leaders are not going to betray you. Like, is it more intense if it happens to you when you're young? I don't know if anybody knows.
Well, that would also vary so much by personality, by who the individual is, but certainly it could. An 18-year-old that's just been recruited, and I don't know how quickly that person would be overseas, for example, but it can also happen on a base um, when you experience betrayal, such as military sexual trauma, for example. So moral injury has a way of emerging in multiple ways. Um, but for my mind, part of what you've raised is the complexity of your experience in combat. Um, in a war, you came quickly to discern we shouldn't have been there. That's your and then the experiences within that war, whether it was what you saw Iraqis do to others, or what often you felt you saw our country fail, representatives of our country and persons perhaps in rank above you that should have had responsibility for your care, and you didn't experience them um, uh, living up to that responsibility. Would that brief summary, kind of muddled, reflect your experience?
Yeah, I would say in part, certainly. I mean, one of the, in my military experience, I feel like some of the best and worst in leadership. I mean, I experienced people that were put in charge of a few people or lots of people that have absolutely no business doing it. There's no excuse for it. And it was a sign of a completely broken military that these people were allowed to be in charge. So, um, whether sociopathic or completely unqualified. On the other end of the spectrum, I, was lucky. I mean, some people go through the military with just terrible leadership the whole time, but I was lucky to have incredible leaders that really taught me. I mean, one of the things Thomas Ricks, who wrote Fiasco about Iraq, he also wrote a book called The Generals, which I haven't read, but as I understand it, it's about a phenomenon that goes on in the military that so many of us know full well. If you are a leader or an officer that stands up to orders or kind of a way of doing things that is not protecting your men or even helping the mission or whatever it is, you are marked and you are not promoted as fast as those who kiss ass, pardon my French, and just are willing to do whatever they're told, right? And this is a well-known thing in the military. And best officer I ever knew got out because I don't know if he'd admit it, but I think it was certainly in part because of that, and other non-commissioned officers. And so, again, it just goes back to these choices. When I enlisted on my first tour, it was kind of the second year-ish. We were in Iraq, and people in my unit that were on the first tour, what they call the initial push in 2003, talked about how they were expecting to go home in months, and nobody was thinking about how we were going to be there for many, many years, right? And what that does, and it started happening when I joined, is the military needs bodies, and that's why you're deploying National Guard units to combat in Iraq, like the unit we replaced, that have absolutely no business doing that. And that's not what they're designed for. It's not what and it's completely unfair. That's why you're letting in people, including people I serve with, that have absolutely no business with a rifle in their hands, right? Because you need bodies. Those are policy choices that we as a society made,
Right. Rita Brockus sent us a message to remind us that of really one of the first persons to help us understand this concept of moral injury. He made the case that Jonathan Shea, no matter how well established and secure a person's character is, it's possible to have an experience so devastating that you are morally injured. And I think that's part of what each of you either observed or you had experienced yourself. Being unprepared for how could you have been for some of what you would experience, whether betrayals within ranks or seeing the devastation of war beside you with persons that you had come to hold quite dear. And I don't know how anybody can be prepared for that. So how a person would emerge from war without multiple experiences of moral injury would leave me questioning. Um, I guess I'd have to say what they took with them into the war. I mean, it is inherently morally injurious, it seems to me. But one of my questions would be, how would you want people, like I'm thinking about some of the folks that are in our audience are chaplains. Others might be in a VA setting, and they're with someone who's a veteran, let's say of Vietnam, and or of Iraq, and they find that out, but maybe they're that person is in there for heart surgery, but they find out this person is a veteran. What from your experience, what would you suggest to such a chaplain about their way of responding to that person, or should inviting conversation, waiting to see if it happens? What would be helpful?
I'll let Alan start on this one if you want to, and I'll go after you.
Yeah, I don't know. I think every situation is different. I would get to know the person at first.
Mhm.
So I'll give you a personal example. So I was wounded in October 2004. It took a couple months, and my dad calling my state senator to get me out of a bed in Iraq and I ended up in Longstool, and I'm in a wheelchair, and I used to go down the elevator and go over to this little coffee shop that was like in the parking lot, and there was this Italian priest that was always in there, and I never said anything to him, but one day he just came up to me and was like, "Oh, because you assume you're in the hospital, like he knew I was wounded, but he never forced anything. He just listened, right? He just let me talk. He just introduced himself and
Mhm.
and just kind of listened to what I had to say. So yeah, if I was to give any advice to folks, chaplains or otherwise, trying to get somebody, like you said, somebody in there for heart surgery to maybe open up about, you're gonna get some people who don't want to, and you're gonna get some people that are begging for it and they just never had the outlet to do it. But I think it's very sensitive, and you just have to start slowly, and you can't just go jump right into talking about the big things. You have to kind of build
Right.
trust in a relationship. And I was in Longstool for a few weeks, and I had coffee with this Italian priest every day, and it was great just to have somebody to talk to. So
Mhm. He had some idea about your experience, but he was letting you decide what the focus was on any given day. Is that what you're telling us?
yeah, he just listened.
Yeah.
I didn't,
Mhm.
I didn't have anybody else
Right.
to listen to me, and he did. So
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think part of what's helpful about your film, and what's also helpful about this conversation that's ranged more widely, is, being aware of how individual the experience of moral injury is, especially as one lives with it. So there's not like some correct way to, there's some things one should not do, but in terms of opening the conversation or just being attentive, if there's an opening, I would think partly what you're saying is that priest apparently indicated that he was open to hearing whatever you wanted to share, but he didn't have an agenda. Is that part of what you're getting at?
Yeah, he
Mhm.
never asked me if I was religious. He never pushed that on me. He just knew that I was fresh home from combat, and I guess I looked like somebody needed to talk to somebody.
Which seemed to have been true, but you didn't need you didn't need to necessarily talk about the war unless you brought it up. Is that fair? Yeah. I think that's a helpful um, lesson or a helpful comment for the folks watching this film whose vocations vary. But what brought them to the film apparently is they were interested in what what your veteran experiences are, and how might that inform. So plenty of these folks are chaplains, um, others are not, but they're aware that there's a particularity to the experience of injury beyond bodily from being in war. And I think that's really valuable. We've got about 8 more minutes, and I'm wondering if there are closing thoughts or additional something that I've talked too much and you haven't had a chance to say, or the question hadn't come up. What would you want this audience to hear about your experience with moral injury and your hopes for what they take from this for their vocations, whatever they are, because many of them are in caring vocations?
I'll just add really briefly, and I'm sorry, I know there's so many questions in the chat. I'm
You're
sorry
great.
we're not able
No worry.
to get to them, but just on that last point, I mean, Alan said it better than I could. We are conditioned, I believe, as a society to assume things about veterans or to place assumptions about their experiences or their beliefs, or fear. Oh my God, they're a ticking time bomb.
Mm.
I know Alan talked a little bit about this. I've talked about it. Tommy, you might find if you encounter veterans in any setting that just asking respectful questions about their experiences, I mean, especially if you preface it with, do you mind if I ask you, do you mind if I ask you, might go a long way than necessarily assuming that they are proud of what they did and trying to kind of validate your own belief in that. So it's a long way of saying, you just ask, you're going to get some very interesting answers. And, you could even mention the film. There's no doubt plenty of veterans that don't necessarily agree with the film, but I neglected to mention this before. I think another amazing experience in making the film was Tommy and I spoke to a lot of veterans that we knew that we'd either served with or that we knew in professional circles that we remain good friends with today, but that don't, that's not their opinion. They really had a different experience and they really have a different belief system than those of us in film. And that's okay. That's okay. Right. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
It's a very good point. Thank you. Alan, how about you?
Yeah, two things scrolling through some of the comments that I kind of wanted to touch on. One was, why do some folks experience moral injury more than others? Quick answer is I don't know. But I do think everybody experiences it in different ways. Sometimes I sit around and think why I'm not worse. Like why I'm not, I'm 100% permanent total from the VA for, injuries, but also for PTSD. But it's like I have a 11-year-old and I've been married for 13 years. And it's like, sometimes I think like, why am I not worse? Like, why do I feel okay? And I think a lot to do with that is like, I spent a really long time, when I got back from Iraq, like processing, like I got back at a very unique time when they didn't have any infrastructure set up for folks coming home. So they just kind of was like, go to your doctor's appointments and we'll see you when we see you. And I could have very easily just screwed off and did what I wanted to do. But I forced myself to go to therapy and see doctors and become, guinea pigs for the army and the amount of medication they put me on. But that helped. I processed a lot of this. And the other question was about Chris Kyle, which is interesting. That was brought up. Why are some folks like portrayed in a certain way, and why do they, or experience deployments differently? And I think and I've been actually talking about this a lot lately. It's like, I think America, we've been involved in these forever wars for 20 years, and they've been horrific and disgusting and somewhat useless, and the amount of casualties and the money spent. We need to put certain people up on pedestals as heroes, be it Marcus Luttrell, be it Chris Kyle, be it Rob O'Neill, be it whoever is a big name, the next person you see sitting in the news saying they did this important thing. I think those folks probably deal with their things the way they deal with them, but I think we need heroes to kind of justify these last 20 years of combat. We need folks that are just like, oh yeah, it was like an everyday job to me, a 9 to 5. I'm cool. I come home and I'm all good with it, which, in my own experience and knowing a lot of folks is just not the case. So I just wanted to kind of touch on those things because I've been thinking about them since they popped up on the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Catie, are there last thoughts you want to share? Any further thoughts?
There was one question that I wanted to get to very quickly. And somebody asked why we changed the name of our film. So the film took 5 years to make. For 4 of those years, the film was called Meat Grinder. And we started with the name Meat Grinder because we thought that that was the most descriptive of what we were trying to communicate, because it took us a while to understand what is really the core of the film. And at first, it was people don't understand what war is. They don't understand what veterans went through. So that's what we're going to tell you. War is a meat grinder. But then we came to understand that that's part of the film, but the core of the film, the heart of the film really is moral injury. And meat grinder is not descriptive of that, and it can confuse you on that. So if the heart of the film is a moral injury, what do you call the film? So we went through many, many possibilities until we realized the film just asks you to open your heart and listen. And so that's why we changed the name to What I Want You to Know.
Yeah.
The other point that I wanted to make was about the narrative that Travis has alluded to, sort of the societal narrative that we as Americans have of veterans as heroes. We want to valorize veterans. We want to put them on a pedestal because it makes us feel good. But I think what we can forget sometimes is that having a pre-existing narrative about a whole class of people and just assuming that they're all the same and they're all heroes and they all want to be valorized just interrupts our ability to listen and our ability to accept information. So, I think that's an awareness that is important for all of us to have, which your audience probably has already.
Yeah. I'm also mindful that, and one of the students that Rita taught while she was at Brite went on to do PhD level work. But one of the first essays that he published had to do with moral injury and serving in this war, and the sense of betrayal because the war was based on a lie. And that was certainly so it would be a different thing if this had really been a threat, and one risks one's life for that. And others have talked about the way in which then the war went on, and America, life just went on because it was a smaller portion of Americans serving in those wars. And the complexity of a veteran's experience in terms of how the war is understood at home, and a sense of the country being mindful of what that sacrifice is. So there's a complex contextual matter in terms of how does the country interpret it. You think about World War II and Vietnam, for example, that strongly illustrates those challenges, the difference. And then also what you went thinking this was one thing, and you discover it's something else, which was this student's case. So, um, um, one of the things in the chat says, has it always been the case that the first casualty of war is truth? I'm not sure I'd go that far, but that is every instance. But I do think that the social context, I guess, is part of what I'm getting at, can also complicate a veteran's experience coming home in terms of what do the folks or the civilians around them understand about that war, and how do they respond? And that's also been a complexity of these wars that the film includes. I think there's no question that your conversation has been rich for our audience, and it will be for the others who observe it. And we're very grateful for your willingness to share what you have with us today. We thank the audience, and I'll remind you that if you want to see this again or reference it for others, this film will be available. The film of this webinar will be available in about 10 days at the most. And you are aware that through the generosity of our team here, the film of What I Want You to Know is available for another day if you didn't have a chance to view it. Thank you so much for being with us today, Alan and Travis and Catie, and for sharing your experience. It's been very helpful, and it's clear from the chat that others have found it so.